Welcome back. You guys having a good time? Happy first day of summer. Pat Abbe has always wanted to perform on a stage where the band Yeasayer has performed. And thanks to Tell Us Something, he gets to do that tonight here at the Wilma. He's been a big fan of Tell Us Something for several years and has previously shared a story at the Top Hat. You can find his story online at tellussomething.org. It's a story about a bunch of drinkers with a running problem. The Wankers. Tonight, Pat has driven all the way up from Victor, Montana to share a follow-up story to the Wanker story. Please welcome Pat Abbe.
Hi. Several years ago I did a story here about a running club that I was a member of, the Wanker Running Club. And it was about an event that we ran into, and it was pretty funny. But there's a prequel to that story and a couple of events that happened to me that led up to me becoming a wanker, or one of the wankers. Anyway, so it happened many years prior to that. I don't really remember everything that happened that night, but I do remember that there was quite a bit of drinking, and about 1 o'clock in the morning, CA and I decided to go to the local diner for breakfast. It was obligatory when you're drinking, you have to go at breakfast. And it was on the way back home where we decided that we were going to set a land speed record for 2 people on a Vespa 150 motor scooter. And we lived in the country, and it was on a country road where it opened up into a 4-lane highway where it went underneath the interstate. So we were tucked down, and the goal was 50 miles an hour. And I'm not sure what happened, if he passed out or he fell asleep, but the next thing I remember is hitting a big bump, losing my grip, falling backward in slow motion and bouncing along the road, and I ended up in a sitting position. CA was laying in the middle of the southbound lane, and the bike was laying next to him. He was face down. And I said, CA, we gotta get the fuck out of here. And I tried to get up off the ground, and my legs stayed there. The sense of panic started to come down on me, kind of like it is right here tonight. And I knew that I wasn't going anywhere, and he wasn't going anywhere, and there was no cars. There was a couple of cars that probably went by on my side, whether they saw us or not, I don't know. It was dark at night. But there's one thing that I've carried with me all my life, and on his side of the road, there was this yellow Volkswagen that came up and at the last minute swerved to go around him and kept going. And at this point, I'm hysterical and probably in shock and everything like that. I don't know really what happened, but somebody did eventually stop, and ambulances came. We went to the hospital. I was transferred to another hospital, and I had 7 hours of surgery, and I spent 10 days in the hospital, and I had a cast from my asshole down to my toes in a awkward position. But unbeknownst to me, and my parents knew, but I didn't, the severity of the injury. And basically I had shredded all the meniscuses, or whatever they're called, the ligaments off my left leg, my left knee. So fundamentally, the only thing that was holding it on was the skin and the artery on that. So they were concerned that I would never walk again. And they were also concerned that I'd have no lateral stability because they took all that out. They cut the hamstring, they drilled a hole through the femur, they sutured it in, they put back what they could, and set me on my way. I went back to school, college, and therapy. And when it was all said and done, I could stand, I could walk, but I could only bend my leg about 80 degrees, 75 or 80 degrees. And this is when the doctors, or I say now, this is my can't years, and the doctors inform me what I can't do. And I can't play football, can't play baseball, can't play any sports, tennis, skiing, sailing, I was a sailor, I was a runner. Can't do any of these things. They kept saying, this is it, you can walk, and that's as good as it gets. I also learned that I can't sit in the back seat of a car, I can't kneel in church, I can't walk up and down stairs. I had to lead with my right foot going up, my left foot going down. I walked with a slight limp. And then most of all, I can't fall. So I learned to always look where I was putting my left foot before I did it. And it just, over the years, it became second nature because it was something I just couldn't do. I couldn't fall on that. So I kind of felt sorry for myself for 3 or 4 or 5 years. And as Gonzo said, there was drugs back then, so that kind of helped out a little bit. And then I met my wife, and she was an avid skier, and I really wanted to go skiing, but I can't. But about the same time, there was this hospital in New York that had, Lenox Hill Hospital, had invented a knee brace, a derotation knee brace for Joe Namath, the football player. And so I kind of like the doctors, and we got together and took a cast of my leg, had one made, and it was a pretty cool brace. It fit on your knee, over your knee, strapped on the top, strapped on the bottom, and basically you would break your leg top or bottom, but your knee would be fine. And trust me, this was pretty cool. So I could go skiing, and off I went skiing. It was a little awkward because my leg from the knee down was kind of like this piece of wood, and the toes didn't work or anything like that. So anyway, I went skiing, I started sailing again, started playing baseball. I was allowed to get a hit, get on base, they'd put a pinch runner in, and then I could come back and play. We had special rules for me, because with the brace and running, it was kind of, I'd get 2 legs behind me, and it's really hard to run with 2 legs behind you, and the brace was kind of good. So this went on, but I was doing shit, so it was good. And so then it was one time, there was a friend of mine, he was running a road race, and I watched him, I said, hey, I can do that, I watch where I'm going, it's a straight line. And so off came the knee brace, and I ran like a mile, and I ran a race, ran another race. I got pretty comfortable with it, and my legs started to work again. And I started getting better, I started getting faster, and then I decided to run a marathon. So at this point, you do speed work on the track when you're training. So I ran into this group of guys that were running on the track at the same time. They were the Wankers. They were a bunch of Brits, and that's where I met them. And we all trained together. They were doing marathons, so I went on and I did New York, and I finished. And my knee was kind of ugly looking because there was no muscles in it. And so they took me to the medic's tent, which was pretty cool. You got hot chocolate and tea and soup, and they massaged you, and the doctors looked at you, and then they sent you on your way. And so that was great. So the Wankers and I ran together for about 8 years. We all were pretty good runners. I got better. I was under 40 minutes for 10Ks for about 6 years, and I was always under 20s for 5Ks. And I went on to do 3 more marathons before I finally retired. My best was like 3 hours and 11 minutes and 7 seconds, because you remember that kind of stuff. And that's the story. So it was like, you can and you can't, and pretty much that was the name of the game. But the one question I've always had, especially today, was, back then they didn't have cell phones, and I always wondered how the hell they called the police and the ambulances. You're out in the middle of nowhere, and so I'm hoping that whoever was driving the yellow Volkswagen went to a phone and called the police or somebody like that. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you, Pat. I wondered about that yellow Volkswagen guy, too. Kathy Witkowsky has spent most of her life as a journalist, researching and telling other people's stories in newspapers, magazines, on the radio, and in documentary films. Tonight, she's branching out, and she's going to share a story of her own. Please welcome Kathy Witkowsky.
This story is dedicated to the love of my life, Jay Kirby. I first met Jay a number of years ago through mutual friends. And then 3 years ago, I hired him to design a remodel project for my house. When I first spoke to him about it, he used his usual spiel on me, explaining why he loved to be an architect. He said, "I make people's dreams come true." He said this looking straight into my eyes. I thought, I really don't know what my actual response was, but to myself I thought, some of my dreams maybe, all of them, probably not. But Jay had other ideas, and along with my house, he quickly went to work on me. He was good at both jobs. So good that within a short period of time he had moved in. The remodel project was being done pro bono. And much to my astonishment, at 52, I had long thought that true love had passed me by. He really was making all my dreams come true. Jay had every attribute I could possibly have hoped for in a partner. In fact, as far as I could tell, he only had 2 flaws. 1, he was kind of forgetful, and 2, he was extremely allergic to stinging insects, bees, wasps, yellow jackets. But he had EpiPens, and he knew they worked because he'd had to use them before. And I figured if I had to remind him to make a few important phone calls or help him find his keys occasionally, it was a small price to pay to live with someone so lovely. So that following year was the happiest year of my life up to that point. And that's saying a lot, considering that we not only endured a major remodel together, which went on 3 times longer than it was supposed to. That's no kidding. If anybody's been through a remodel, they know that's not uncommon. But that somewhere in the middle of it, I was diagnosed with cancer and had to begin a 7-month regimen of chemotherapy and radiation. So not exactly a recipe for domestic bliss. In fact, either one of those things could easily have ruined another romantic relationship. But for Jay and I, it just allowed us to see what we were made of, and we liked what we saw, and we became closer. Thank you. That fall, I received a clean bill of health, and we rejoiced. Thank you. And we carried on creating the life that we had envisioned for ourselves. We had gotten the memo from the universe. We understood that life was both precious and fragile, and we were going to take advantage of every day that we could together. But the universe seemed to think that we hadn't read the memo carefully enough. Because last summer, July 22nd, to be exact, a Friday, right around 5 o'clock, Jay called me at home. He had been working at a rental property he owned on 4th Street near the Good Food Store, and told me he'd been stung. And I bet you can guess what the next line was. He'd forgotten his EpiPens at home. He was preparing to drive himself to the hospital. He told me where the EpiPens were. I said I would grab them and meet him there, and that when we hung up, he should call 911. Now, this wasn't as crazy an idea as it sounds at first. We knew that there was generally a lag time between when he was stung and when the anaphylactic shock would set in, and rather than sit around and wait for an ambulance to show up, it made more sense for him to drive himself to St. Pat's, which was only about 1.5 miles away, and even in rush hour traffic shouldn't take him more than 10 or possibly 15 minutes. But when I got in my car, I realized I had a better idea, and that was that I should intercept him on the way to the hospital. Our house was on near Russell Street on the north side of the bridge, and he would be driving across Russell Street from the south side of the bridge. So I called him to tell him that I would intercept him on the bridge, where no doubt he would be stopped in traffic. It would be easy enough to see his green truck, and I would be able to hop out and give him the EpiPens. So I called him. There was no answer. So I called 911, and they told me that, in fact, he had called them, but that they had to put him on hold because there's only one dispatcher on at a time, and they'd had another call coming in. And when they went back to his line, they'd been disconnected. The last they knew, he was at 3rd and Russell. They had told him to pull over and wait for help. I thought, okay, I'm going to find him at 3rd and Russell. Now, if you've ever been on Russell Street during rush hour, you know that traffic is very slow. It seems a whole lot slower when you think your beloved is on the other end in anaphylactic shock. But I finally made it to 3rd and Russell. Sure, I was going to find his truck. It wasn't there. I thought, well, I must have just missed him. I don't know how, but well, there's a lot of green trucks. Maybe I just didn't see him. So I turned around and I started coming back over the bridge, thinking he had made it to the hospital. Please be okay. Please be okay. Please be okay. Please be okay. At the emergency room, they told me they had not seen a bee sting victim. Now I was really at a loss. This was pretty much had all the ingredients of a nightmare that you cannot wake up from. It was inconceivable to me that the universe, which had finally sought to bless me with such a wonderful partner and a beautiful love, was going to snatch it away from me like this. Jay, where are you? Where are you? Where are you? Where are you? Please be okay. Please be okay. Please be okay. I drove past our house thinking maybe he'd gone there. Of course, he wasn't there. I drove back across Russell Street, thinking maybe he'd gotten confused and gone back to his rental property. He wasn't there. Please be okay. Please be okay. Please be okay. Please be okay. I wasn't sure what to do at this point, but just as I hit 3rd and Russell, it suddenly occurred to me that maybe he had taken a different route to the hospital. Maybe he decided to stay on 3rd and go across Orange Street. And indeed, within a few blocks, I spotted his truck parked in a parking lot of a local business. And that's when things went from surreal to suddenly very, very, very real and horrifying. Because when I looked in the truck, Jay was slumped against the driver's side door, his face ashen, his mouth open. I started to shriek. He did not respond. I couldn't remember how to administer the EpiPens. Fortunately, I saw someone I knew on the sidewalk and somehow managed to convey to him what was happening. He got in the truck, administered the Eppies. His companion called 911. The two of them dragged Jay out of the truck, put him on the sidewalk, started to administer CPR while we waited for the ambulance. The rest of that day passed in a blur. I was in the ambulance. Jay had a faint heartbeat. They did not have to use the AED. But it was pretty clear from the conversation I was hearing in the back of the ambulance, I was in the passenger seat, that it was a little touch and go. At the emergency room, they sedated and intubated him. I had a few friends come to show me support. It was fairly clear he was going to live. It wasn't clear how much damage had been done or how long he'd been without oxygen. I stayed that night in the hospital with him. They put him in ICU, intubated. His wrists were strapped to the bed so he wouldn't pull out the tube. They kicked me out at midnight. I came back the next day around mid-morning. They did remove the tube. And miraculously, Jay came to after the sedatives were off, and he was back to his normal self. Giddy, in fact. I wasn't sure whether that was the medication or the fact that he was just so happy to be alive. But soon it became fairly clear that we had another obstacle because he had virtually no short-term memory. And every time I tried to explain to him what had happened, he would retain it for about 5 minutes. And then he would ask me over and another time, why does my chest hurt? What day is it? And went on and on like this. They finally discharged Jay the next day, but the nurse wasn't terribly optimistic that he would recover his memory. So I began to prepare myself for a lifetime of compensating for this. I got him a notebook. I got him a pen. I told him he had to take detailed notes of every conversation he had. People compensate for much worse things. So I figured, okay, this is our new life together. As it turned out, that was not our new life together. By the end of that week, Jay had recovered his short-term memory, in as much as he's ever had a short-term memory, that is. But that's actually a good thing, because now that he's gone through a series of desensitizing shots and is no longer allergic to stinging insects, that leaves him with only one flaw. And I really don't think I would have married him if he'd been too perfect. So, thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Jay, I'm glad you made it. Well, I'll forget things. Like, where's my glasses? Oh, they're right here. Hilly McGahan was born and raised in Arlee, Montana. She has worked as a domestic violence attorney on the Flathead Reservation since 2012. She received her bachelor's degree from the University of Montana in 2007 and her Juris Doctor from the University of Cincinnati School of Law in 2012, where she was a fellow with the Urban Morgan Institute for Human Rights and the Ohio Innocence Project. Before law school, Hilly worked as a human rights accompanier in Guatemala, where she lived and traveled with witnesses testifying in genocide cases. Hilly enjoys fishing and hiking with her husband Jacob and their young sons Theo and Julian. She also enjoys being on time and eating good food with her enormous extended family. Please welcome Hilly McGahan.
My parents made a living when I was growing up as beekeepers. I was born and raised in Arlee, along the Jocko River, where we had our family honey business. We lived really simply. We grew most of our own food, and we ate wild game, and we lived in a log cabin. And the bulk of the work was during the summer. That was when we worked in the vegetable gardens and when we extracted the honey. My dad would pull the honey in from yards that we had all over northwestern Montana, and we would extract the honey in our honey house and spend hot, sticky days getting it ready to pour and package. But in the winter, when the bees were holed up in their hives, we would drive to Mexico. And we traveled about as simply as we lived at home. We would pack up our old Subaru. My dad, Jerry, would drive. My mom, Janet, would sit up front. My sister, Romy, and I would sit in the back. And then we would have 6 weeks worth of camping and food things spilling all around us in the car. So we'd set off from Arlee, and we'd take about 3.5 days to get down to the Sonoran Desert. My dad never drove over 55 miles an hour. That was partly for fuel efficiency. and partly because if he drove our car over 55 miles an hour, it started to shake. So even though Dad drove really slowly, he hated to make, probably because he drove really slowly, he hated to make unnecessary stops on the way down, and so we always had to coordinate our pee stops with our gas stops, with our heating up food in the gas station microwave stops. And then we'd get down to the town called Bahia de Quino, where we would usually camp outside of, in a little secluded area in the desert on the coast of the Gulf of California, and we would spend 6 weeks there. And 6 weeks is long enough for mice to start living in your car. It's long enough to miss the shortest, darkest days of the Montana winter, which was also important for Dad and for all of us. And it was long enough to really get settled into a really beautiful place. One particular year, when I was 12 years old and my sister Romy was 15, we had spent our 6 weeks in the desert, and we were getting ready to head back to Arlee. And so we packed up camp and started on day one of the road trip north. The day got off to a really bizarre start when, on the highway, driving towards the border, a dead dog flew out of the truck in front of us, and its stiff, rigor mortis-stricken body clattered along beside us on the highway. As we got closer to the border, we realized that we also had a bag of unused Mexican limes. And if there's one thing that my family never did or does, it's waste food. And fruit is also a particular delicacy because we also never really ate anything that was out of season and didn't buy a lot of groceries at home. So citrus was something special. In Montana, we would mostly eat Dad's apples out of the root cellar in the winter, which were starting to taste like the root cellar. So Mom scrambled to figure out what to do with these limes that were either going to be confiscated or thrown out by the time we got to the border, which was coming pretty soon. And so she picked up our water jug, which I vividly remember was an old Langer's apple juice jug that has that sort of milky, thick plastic. It's kind of cloudy and almost opaque. And she picked up that water jug that we had our water in, and she squeezed all the limes into it because we were going to have a batch of limeade from the limes. And by the time we got to the border, she'd solved the lime problem. Along the way, though, she'd also somehow lost the cap to the Langer's jug. And so, in the busyness of crossing the border from Nogales, Mexico into Nogales, Arizona, she didn't know where it had gone. So we got a motel. We either camped along the way or stayed at really cheap motels on the drive down and on the drive up. So we got a motel in Nogales, and being a desert where we were and still kind of being chilly at night, Mom just left the Langer's jug on the floor of the passenger seat of the car. And the next morning, she located the cap somewhere in the car. She got some sugar packets from the restaurant near the motel we were staying at. We hit the road. She ripped open those packets and put them in, made the final ingredient of limeade. She shook it up and swirled it around, and we just headed towards home on the second day of the road trip. Mom opened it up somewhere in Arizona and took some long gulps from it. And she offered some to my dad, who declined because he was still drinking his motel coffee. She poured some in a cup and handed it back to Romy and me, and Romy had some long drinks. Mom took another long pull. And then all of a sudden, in a voice that we'll always remember, Mom said, "Jesus, Jerry, pull over." And my dad, who hated unnecessary stops and unnecessary drama in general, immediately pulled over. And before we even came to a stop, Mom opened her door and hurled the Langer's jug out of the car. And we quickly learned that one of those desert mice that had been living in our car had climbed into the opened Langer's jug the night before and drowned. My mom described the scene that followed as an unprecedented uproar, where I bolted out of the car and inexplicably started running and crying. And Romy got out of the car and informed the family that she would not get back in the car until and unless they took her to a hospital to get her stomach pumped. Somehow, I don't know how, I also don't know what happened to the Langer's jug, Romy and I were coaxed back into the car, and we continued our drive north. I don't know that there are any lessons to be learned from this story. Maybe that you should throw the limes out before you get to the border, or if you're gonna make limeade in a cloudy Langer's old apple juice jug, that you shouldn't lose the cap, or that you shouldn't camp for so long that mice start living in your car. But we kept up our trips to Mexico for years and years after that. I even kept going with my parents when I was in college. And they were wonderful trips. Last October, my dad died, and I know that I speak for my whole family when I say that we'd give anything for one last road trip with Jerry McGahan. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilly. Anybody thirsty? Born in Norway, Svein Newman was kicked out of that country as a child for being bad at skiing. True story. Svein Newman has since roamed around Montana. He grew up on a family farmland in south central Montana and went to college here at UM. And after a 6.5-year stint in Billings, he's once again a Missoulian. When he's not busy being afraid of speaking on stage, Svein works for a conservation and family agriculture nonprofit called Northern Plains Resource Council. He also volunteers with Soft Landing Missoula, He serves on the board of the Montana Human Rights Network and enjoys divey cowboy bars, day hikes, and the board game Settlers of Catan. Please welcome Svein Newman.
When I was a child, I used to struggle with what I was going to be when I grew up. Maybe you did too. I think it's pretty common. And my mom is maybe the smartest person I know. She gave me some advice. She said, Svein, everyone is uniquely good at something. Everyone has a special talent. Find yours, pursue it, and you can't go wrong. And it took me years, but I finally figured out that what I'm uniquely good at is worrying. Which isn't always great when you're telling stories. It also isn't always great when you travel. And don't get me wrong, I love traveling. I travel for work, I travel for fun. One of my life goals is to make it to every continent. I'm a lot of the way there. And indeed, I'm not really worried about being there, about being in other places. I find that I learn a lot about myself. In a lot of ways, I learn more about my home when I'm away from it. And I also think that the gift and the curse of being American is that you can never fully get outside of your own culture. I was in a rural grocery store in a rural country in the Himalayas that didn't get TV until 1999, and then still only limitedly, not a lot of foreigners there. And I still heard Taylor Swift on the radio. So I'm not, which was really eerie, worried. People knew Hannah Montana. They didn't know Montana. It created some really weird situations. But I'm not worried about being other places. What I worry about is airports. And I'll tell you why. My first trip to the Minneapolis airport was a couple of years after 9/11. It was my first time flying after 9/11. And I had a multi-hour layover, maybe 3 hours, and at a certain point I needed to use the restroom. And I don't know how much time you've spent in airport men's restrooms. I'm gonna guess that question splits the audience about 50-50, but whether you know or whether I'm sure you can imagine, sometimes the floors are, shall we say, a little bit sticky. And this one was particularly sticky, and so I didn't want to set my bag down. I didn't know what would happen, right? I was like, I have all these scenarios running. And so I had a really great idea. I thought, maybe I'll just ask a shop to hold my bag for me. And those of you who are groaning or laughing, you know, right? You've heard the every 20 minutes announcement over the intercom that that's not a thing that you do, but I hadn't heard this yet. And so I go from coffee shop to bookstore asking if they'll watch my bag for me. And they say no, because of course apparently terrorists hate lattes and novels almost as much as they hate liberty. But undeterred, I have an even better idea, because I passed by an area, kind of a corner where nobody was sitting, and there was kind of a column that obscured view, and there were some seats, so I thought if I just hide my bag, it'll be fine, it'll still be there when I get back. And so I go to the restroom, you know, I'm going about my business, and I hear this announcement over the intercom, Svein Newman, please come to gate E27 to claim your bag. And mostly I'm impressed that they got my name right, because I have an uncle who 30 years later still can't do it. But obviously it's a little jarring too, but there's not a lot I can do, so I sort of continue going about my business. And they announce again, Svein Newman, please come to gate E27 now. So I hurry and I sprint there, and there's a flight attendant on the phone with TSA to come detonate my bag at a personal cost of $2,000 to me, because freedom isn't free. And we start to talk, and we enter into a sort of negotiation, which becomes a lot easier once we both realize that we're on the same team of me being an idiot. And in exchange for promising to never have children or pass on my idiot genes, she agrees to give me my bag back and waive the fee. No harm, no foul. And I tell you this only to set up my second trip to the Minneapolis airport. I was flying back from Norway, and you have those long transatlantic flights, and I was sitting next to a guy, and I was nervous. I normally don't talk to people on flights, but I had these nervous jitters, and so I decided that I need to. But apparently, I'm bad at making conversation when I'm nervous, because I'm like, so airplanes, huh? But it works. Like, it shouldn't work, but it works. It turns out this guy does international quality control for IBM. He flies for a living, and so he's telling me all of these stories about his adventures all over the world. And at a certain point, he tells me something that should have been foreshadowing, but which I took as reassuring, which I needed at the time. He said, Svein, it's eerie. I've never seen anyone stopped by airport security. I've never seen it happen. And I was like, oh, well, that's great. Maybe this time Minneapolis will be different. And so the plane touches down, and we're at the back of the plane, so we're at the back of the security line when we get off and are waiting, and this sort of gruff TSA officer walks kind of up and down the snaking line until he gets to me, and he stops. And he says one word, he says, passport. So I hand it to him, and he looks at it, looks at me, looks at it. Montana, huh? And I say, yeah, yes, officer. And he says, that doesn't look like a Montana hairstyle to me. I had long hair at the time, and I tried to explain to him that I live in Missoula, and we do things a little differently there. But he's not having it. And so he writes, in block letters, sin, on my customs declaration form. And maybe it stands for security index, I don't know. But literally SIN, and he sends me over to a much more policed line of just me. And I get grilled, right? So it's like, where are you coming from today? Well, I was in Oslo. What were you doing there? I visited my father. Oh, so you must visit your father pretty often, huh? Actually, I haven't visited my father in 7 years. You haven't visited your father in 7 years? I know I'm a bad son. I'm trying to get better. It's a long road. And I just like get questioned by person after person. You know, they ask me my major like 7 times, figuring I'll eventually slip up and reveal that I'm flying to Montana to blow up some cows or something. And we unpack my bag. I show them, this is actually the fun part, I show them my vacation photos to prove that I don't have like a photo of me and my dad planting a bomb in Chechnya or something. But the tone changes, right? Because the first person is like, you know, Frank picked you out and Frank never gets them wrong. We got you, we're onto you, we know. And then by the third person and the fourth person, they're like, we're so sorry, it's completely random. We just have to grab like one of every so many people, just happens to be you. And it's like, no, I'm a single white college-age male with long hair and a natural tremor traveling from a layover in Amsterdam. You can just ask me where my pot is. It's at home, not in my bag. But you know, I was there for a while. I was there for a few hours, and so eventually, like I pushed limits, and so they're asking me questions, so I start asking questions back, right? Because I'm like, we're getting to know each other. This is this activity, and it's very rude for only you to get to ask the questions. So you know, where are you from? How long have you had this job? Do you like it? That's a shiny gun. Have you ever had to use it? And we kind of get to become friends. And they let me go, and it's fine. And I learned something from that experience. Every time now that I travel through customs, I shave up to just a mustache, because it's clear that I love NASCAR too much to be a terrorist. I promise, it's like I've never had any incidents since. But I've also learned another thing traveling. I think earlier I said that I think I learn more about where I live when I leave it. And I don't know if any of y'all have read the book Eat, Pray, Love. And for the rest of you, don't worry about it. I haven't either. I hear it's only okay. But I'm told that there's a scene in it in which the narrator says that every town has a word, and you're supposed to find the town that matches your word. And so New York's word is ambition, and Rome's word is sex. And the longer that I'm here, and the more I leave and come back, the more I think that for me, Missoula's word is home. And I'm not that worried about it. Thank you.